Let's crack straight on. What's in my talk? Well, this talk is about a model that I've developed over a number of years. It's a way that I use to help people understand what's important in testing in an agile context, and it's also a model that I use as a way of assessing how an organization stands when it comes to their maturity, if you like, of agile testing. I stay away from the term maturity model, though. Okay, that's not. I'm not trying to put out another maturity model in the world. I think we've already got enough of those. As far as this talk is concerned, I'm also going to teach you a little bit about some Greek classical architecture. I'm going to try to avoid the furniture here. There's another sort of style that I use in my talk, which is to, in recognition that the way a lot of people take notes these days is just to photograph the slides that they're interested in. Well, you may know that I don't use PowerPoint, I use Prezi, which means that my slides tend to zoom around, zoom in, zoom out, that sort of thing. Which means that it's often difficult to know whether you've got the sort of the right position. So just to help you, I put little camera icons in the corner of the slides where it might be a good opportunity to take a photo, just to help you out there. Now, if you've done a bit of reading around sort of agile testing, you may think that this title, The Pillars of Agile Testing, is something you've heard before. So it's just a quick caveat. This talk is nothing to do with Bob Galen's book that has a similar title. So Bob is a consultant based in America, and he has written a book called The Three Pillars of Agile Quality and Testing. Now, there's no suggestion that there's any sort of plagiarism or anything like that. Using pillars as a conceptual theme is a fairly common thing to do. It so happens that both Bob and I have used that metaphor in describing our models of testing in an agile context. So anyway, what I'm talking about is different to what he talks about. I invite you to go and read Bob's book, and you'll get some extra information there. Okay, that's my talk. Let's crack on. I thought I would start with an executive summary. I know there are people who don't necessarily want to sweat the details. They might want to switch to things. So here's the thing: if you remember these things, you've remembered the important elements of this talk. To succeed with agile testing in your organization, there are 4 important things that you always need to focus on. 4 things that you need to improve. Those things are providing stronger evidence to your stakeholders, designing better test cases. There's ensuring you have greater coverage of your models of risk, and providing faster feedback to everyone involved in your process about the quality of your system. Improving those 4 things is how you'll succeed with agile testing. It's easy to say, just go and do those things. Those things are dependent on many things that you need to get right in your organization. And the summary categories of those things are: you need to have the right team structures that allow people to collaborate effectively. You need to have the appropriate skills and capabilities of the people working in your organization. And you need to put in place the appropriate technical foundations to support those people. So that's the basic structure of this model. Before I get into the model, though, I'll give you a very short bit of history about how this was developed. Before I went independent, I worked for a largish software testing consultancy in the UK, and we were sort of facing the usual challenge, I guess, of competition from other people who were providing similar services, similar testing services that might have had a cheaper rate than we did. And so we were finding, our lunch was kind of being eaten, if you like, by others. And so the management team said, well, we don't want to compete on price because we believe we're the higher quality guys. So what are we going to do about this? I said, well, it shouldn't be that hard. It's like any marketplace. You don't necessarily make it a race to the bottom. You don't have to always be the cheapest. People will choose to pay more for a premium product if they recognize that what they're getting is better quality than the alternatives. So all we need to do is prove that we've got the higher quality product. So they said, that sounds good, David. Right now, what is our product? And what is the product when you're testing? What's the thing you produce? And that's not such an easy answer to provide. I did know that there's one thing that it's definitely not, and I hope you already realize this. It's not the Q word, okay? As testers, you don't produce quality. And it's easy to believe that that's what you do. It's easy to fall into that trap of, well, we create quality. Unfortunately, we don't. We provide evidence about quality. We provide confidence in people's decisions about what they should do with their software. That's kind of what we provide. So we, to use a courtroom analogy, we don't judge software in the sense that we don't make the judgment. It's our stakeholders that do that. What we are in that courtroom analogy is the expert witness. We're the ones called upon to provide strong evidence about the thing on trial. Do we condemn this software? Do we release it? And the strength of our testimony, again, I like that word, I like the fact that testimony has test in it. The strength of our testimony as an expert witness will depend on many things. How credible are we? Do people actually believe we know what we're talking about? Are we sticking to the facts? Are we showing things that the ordinary lay person wouldn't have found? Those are all things that you would expect of an expert witness. And it's that testimony that gives a judge confidence in their judgment. And that's exactly what we need to provide as testers. We provide greater confidence to our stakeholders. So that's the product that we produce. If we're doing more and better testing, we are giving people more and better confidence in their decisions about, do we release, do we condemn, do we rewrite, and so on. So that's that's my starting point. That's my axiom, if you like, that the product of testing is confidence, and hence my model is based on the idea that confidence is the goal. That's the thing we're trying to push up. Okay. Now, Donata's kindly mentioned in the intro a couple of books that I've been involved with. This is one that I don't claim to be a co-author of, but I was a contributor to this book. It's More Agile Testing by Lisa Chrisman and Janet Gregory. Can I ask quickly, does anyone have this book? Has anyone bought this? Yep, we've got a few. It's a good book. It's definitely worth adding to your library. So I was kindly asked by Lisa and Janet to contribute along with many other authors. And what I said, well, I have a model called the Pillars of Testing. That's what I'm using at the moment. Maybe that's worth sharing. And that's what they did. They liked it and they included it. For those who do own the book, you'd be forgiven if you haven't read to page 402 yet. But that's where you'll find the section on the Pillars of Testing. Now, when I sent this off to Lisa and Janet in the process of writing the book, I was a little bit lazy with my terminology. I was basically saying, okay, well, I've got this this model that I represent as a Greek temple, and so it's got a roof, it's got pillars, and it's got foundations, and I put various words on there to represent the model of testing in there, and I kind of left it at that. They said, "Oh yeah, that looks good, that's great," and it got published. And I thought afterwards, it's possible that the things I was talking about aren't actually the correct terms, and if I'm going to do a talk about this, I probably ought to investigate what these things really are called. It turns out that pretty much everything I said was wrong in terms of the references to Greek classical architecture. What I should have done, had I done it correctly and had I done this research beforehand, is I should have said, I represent this model as a tetra-style Doric temple, which comprises a pediment, columns, and crepidoma. Yes, those are all real words. I haven't made them up. Now, here's a quick test. Vilnius, it's an educated crowd here, so I'm going to test you. Can anyone tell me why this is specifically a Doric temple? So there are several orders of classical architecture. Why Doric? Was a volunteer here? Yes, because of the columns. Yes, specifically, what is it on the columns? Excellent, excellent. You can tell from the style of the capital on the top of the column that this is a Doric temple because it follows the Doric classical order. Now, as was correctly identified, there are three orders of classical Greek architecture. So we've just seen the example of the Doric, which has the sort of fairly simple round, it's called an abacus that sits on top of the capital. The Ionic order is the one that has those sort of fluty-looking bits on the side. Those are known as volutes, V-O-L-U-T-E-S. And the rather more ornate Corinthian order has those funny leafy bits on it. They're known as the leafy bits. No, they're called acanthus leaves. So that's the classical Greek capitals. Compare that with modern Greek capitals. There is only one. That's a joke, guys. You're allowed to laugh here. And of course, Roman capitals, of which there are 26. Oh, you're a tough crowd. You look, I tell this at a typesetting conference. They love that joke. They're falling in the aisles with that one. Okay, enough of this. Let's get on with the real stuff. So, an explanation of the pillars model. So it's a model that works for me. Okay, so that's my caveat. First caveat. When anyone sort of expresses a model, remember this quote from George Box. He says, all models are wrong. Some are useful. Okay, so I'm hoping that this model will be useful to you. Secondly, it's been useful to me, but your mileage may vary. Okay, that's a useful Agile term. You can't presume that things that work in one context are going to work in every context. Okay, please bear that in mind. So it comprises a set of things that I think are important that, to be improved in your organization in the context of testing, and perhaps more importantly, it shows what are those things dependent on, how do those dependencies interrelate to each other, so that you can use it as an analysis of saying, if we're struggling in this particular area, what is it that might be an underlying cause of that? Okay, so that's really the purpose of this model, is to try to help identify the relationships between different dependencies that affect the things that ultimately make us better at testing on a wider scale. But it's not a process definition. It's not a, here's step 1 in Agile testing, step 2 in Agile testing. It's not that at all. The way this was developed actually comes over a number of years. This sort of started around about 2007, where I was working with a colleague for an organization, multinational organization, that really had, they said, we want you to come and examine and assess our testing and come up with some kind of global strategy for us. So they were saying things like, well, we're definitely going Agile. What is it we need to do? What do we have to put in our strategy? And we know there's a lot of work to be done, so what do we need to put in place? And so my colleague and I started brainstorming this, and we started listing all the challenges we found, and we were sort of putting them on sticky notes up on this big, great big whiteboard in this big sort of war room that we were using. And we sort of think, this is too big a list. It was like a classic product backlog of thousands of items in it. How on earth do you prioritize all that? So he said, well, the way we're going to cut through this is to start to join things up and say, well, which of these things are related? What's really possibly a cause of another problem? And so we started to arrange our post-it notes that were sticking on the wall into some kind of order where we could draw some lines between them to start to see how those connections unfolded. And sort of that got bigger and bigger, and we started to find some kind of structure to that whole sort of set of relationships. As I say, don't try to look at the details of that. It's intentionally not readable. And it was one of these things where I remember this difficult moment. I was presenting this to the board of this company. The CTO in particular had flown in from another city to see this presentation. the sales guy in my organization was very, very nervous because he says, "You're not going to show that really complicated slide, are you, with all that sort of all the arrows on it?" I said, "Well, yeah, that's the important bit. That's the meat of this." And he thought, "Well, that's a bit of a dodgy thing to do." I insisted. I said, "No, we've been working on this. This is the real work. This is what the guy wants to see." And so after a few slides of sort of fairly dull, sales speak about what a great company we were and what a great partner we'd be for them on this journey, blah, 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 he was kind of glazing over. And then I sort of get to this, and at last his body language changed. He sort of sits forward and his smart eyes sort of light up. And he's looking at the details, and you could see him scanning this, you could see him processing it. He was a smart guy. And he just sort of paused for a while and he said, "David, this is a very important graph." And I thought, oh gosh, I felt so so warmed because, well, he complimented me, but he correctly identified it as a graph. It's the little things that geeks like, that's so. So I knew there was something to this, and because it turned out to be a success, the company said, "Well, could we generalize this?" And so, the next stage was, okay, let's put out a bit more sort of market-friendly version of this. I would call it was dumbed down, but the fact is we had to find some kind of compromise. A lot of what we'd done in the original model was specific to that organization, and then when you try to generalize that for all organizations, obviously you've got to take out a lot of specifics. So we sort of played with this idea of, okay, maybe there are pillars in the middle of this that are things that we can raise higher, and confidence is like our roof that gets pushed higher. So it was we kind of liked it as a theme, but I wasn't happy with the oversimplification of it. So I said, well, okay, I need to sort of try and bring more of that detail back in, but try and preserve the sort of visual effect of this. That it should still look like a temple or something like that with pillars in it, but I wanted to try and show how the details were in place. Now, I'm certainly no graphic designer, and so when I sent this diagram off to Lisa and Janet, and with the accompanying text, I did say, look, you're getting your book published by a professional publisher. There will be people in the organization who are good at taking sort of fairly ugly technical drawings and turning into something that's pretty. So please find somebody to do that and have them do that. This is the version that went to print. So yeah, well, at least they stripped out the gaudy colours. So anyway, the version in the back of Lisa and Janet's book does still look pretty ugly like that. As I say, my graphic design skills haven't improved over time, so I can't say that what I'm showing you now is that much better. But at least it's going to look a bit more authentic because I can at least name the things correctly. So we're going to start by working through the model, but we're going to work on it top down, okay? Because remember, in this case, we start with confidence as our objective, and we're going to work our way down. Now, in this, the section immediately below the pediment, which is that sort of triangular section on the top of the temple, is the region known as the entablature, okay? And inside the entablature, you'll see triglyphs and metopes. So triglyphs are these sort of bits that are sort of brought forward a little bit, and the metopes are the recesses, but the metopes can include these nice bas-relief designs, as you'll see on the more elegant temples. This is one that actually came from the Parthenon and is now being looked after carefully, thanks to Lord Elgin, in the British Museum. But there's a whole range of other stuff that can go in there. I mean, gosh, when you start to look at the details of classical architecture, you realise there's a sudden spike in the number of things that you actually knew nothing about. So, okay, let's leave that behind and let's move on to the model. So, my pediment at the top of my model is confidence. But confidence itself rests on two elements in the entablature. And those two things are safety and courage. So safety is arguably the thing that we traditionally associate with testing. We test to avoid problems. We test to sort of make sure we're reducing risk. We test to make our software development process safe. But that kind of sits slightly in competition with this Agile principle of courage. Courage is what allows us to move quickly, to be able to pivot, to be able to change our minds about things. Courage is what moves us forward. And so confidence struck me as the appropriate balance between safety and courage. Because if you optimize for one thing only, you wouldn't really get anywhere. If you said our priority is that we should always be safe, you would never walk out your front door in the morning. You would never get anything done. If you tried to optimize for courage at the expense of safety, well, that's just foolhardiness. You're going to take all sorts of risks. You're not going to survive very long. So confidence is about the appropriate balance between those two things. Now, the next section of the model, so that was the pediment and entablature. That's courage, confidence resting on courage and safety. Those three things are held up by the pillars, which, using correct terminology, as actually the columns. Now, there's something to be said about columns. Columns aren't straight, okay? If you look at a properly constructed Greek or even Roman temple, you'll notice that they have this sort of slight bulging effect to them. That's known as entasis. And entasis is much more exaggerated on Roman architecture than it is on Greek architecture. And there's the proof that's sort of taken at the British Library, that picture on the right. You can sort of see there's a straight line in the background. You just notice how the column tapers in slightly towards the top. So yes, if you're drawing columns, you draw it with a little bit of narrowing at the top, and that's entasis. Okay, so what about the pillars or columns in my model? Well, these are the things that represent what you might call a valuable quality of testing, okay? And they're designed in such a way that everybody has these things to some extent. No matter how, immature you believe your organization is when it comes to testing, you have each of these four things, you just don't have very much of them. So that was intentional. It's always about something we believe we could improve. And the reverse is also true. However good you think you are, you could always improve these things. You could always get better in each of these things. So if you suffer seasickness, look away now, because I'm going to turn our model on its side. The first of our pillars is about stronger evidence. Now, I talked about that courtroom analogy, that the role that we provide is to be able to supply convincing information to our stakeholders about the quality of our software under test. So how can we expect stakeholders to make good decisions if they don't have the appropriate information? So in order to improve this pillar, in order to provide stronger evidence, what are the kind of things that we need to do? Well, we need to speak their language. We need to focus on the things that they care about. We need to leave out extraneous details that don't matter. We need to focus on the details that do matter. And we need to communicate these in media and in ways that are relevant to reach, to maximize the reach of all the people that are involved in our decision-making process. So whether that's developers on a day-to-day level, whether that's product owners, perhaps on a daily or even sort of iteration-based level, whether that's wider stakeholders in the organization. Find the appropriate media and the appropriate communication mode to be able to convey your information as strong evidence to people so that they can act upon it. Okay, so that's pillar number one, stronger evidence. Better test design is the second one. So this is really, it might seem a bit of an obvious thing, and yet we kind of forget that testing is an exercise in an infinite space. So we need to focus on how do we make best use of the time available for testing by testing the right things as opposed to testing mundane things. So this is about how do we ensure that we are actually focusing on the things that matter to the people that we are serving. One sort of side model, if you like, that might be useful here is reference to I'm sure most of you have done any kind of psychology is familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's a much cited thing. So showing that there are sort of a relationship between the kind of things that we need as human beings, starting from the sort of quite base physiological things at the bottom, like we need air to breathe and we need food and water and so forth, sex, sleep, I don't know what homeostasis is and so forth, and then having, as long as those base needs are satisfied, then your attention turns to higher things. Safety. Am I away from the lions and saber-toothed tigers? Once that's understood and secured, then it's around do I have this sense of belonging? Am I welcomed by the rest of the tribe and so forth? And so on it goes until you get to the sort of very modern things like self-actualization. So it's a much cited model, although I think it's been updated, and I think Wi-Fi goes somewhere in here at the bottom now. My business partner Goiko and I thought about this hierarchy and thought, well, maybe there's some similar model when it comes to testing and quality of software. And we sort of had this notion that the kind of testing that we do primarily these days is really about that bottom level. We tend to test functionality. We tend to test, does this software deploy? But really, that's just one level. And if we've satisfied that level, we should be focusing on higher concerns. So if the thing does what it does, we need to think about how well does it do it? Does it do that thing securely? Does it do that thing quickly? Does it do that thing better than the competition does? Does it do it on my new device that's sort of got a different sort of combination of all the widgets that's on it? Is it usable? It might do all those things quickly and securely, but I find it's a piece of trash that I can't use because I don't understand it. Or maybe it is a good app that I love, but is that really doing anything useful? It's cute, it's fun, but I'm not sure that it actually does anything for me. And of course, the final test is somebody willing to part with their money for it? Does this have value to somebody? There's a surprising, gap between that. Think of all the things that we love on our phone, but would you have to pay £1 for that? Oh, I'm not sure. We love free stuff. Free stuff is easy. Paid for stuff is hard. So, how does this relate to testing? Well, remember that, if you've already satisfied base needs, if you've already got enough food and water, then the next concern is probably somewhere else in your chain. You're not going to make somebody happier by saying, oh, you're feeling unloved? Here's some more air to breathe. It's a little bit like that. It's our customers aren't happy with our software. Oh, but I've checked for all the bugs. Well, you're kind of missing that you're probably testing at the wrong level. And testers need to start thinking more in terms of these higher levels. It's easy to say, oh, but that's a business concern. That's not my concern as a tester. Oh, this is where my job description lies. I don't think that's acceptable. I think we need to start, seeing the role of providing feedback and providing evidence as applying all the way up this chain. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So pillar number 3 is greater coverage. Okay, so this is all about how much of our models of risk are tested by the activities that we undertake. So how much the system is tested compared to our models of risk. Okay, and there's that word model again. So every time you talk about coverage, it's coverage in relation to a model. You don't provide coverage of the software under test because really the software under test is about making people's lives better. Okay? It's very hard for us to say I've got 80% coverage of that. Everything that we measure is a representation of the real thing that matters. Okay? It's a model of the thing that matters. And we use different models for different purposes. And my little caveat here is that, okay, you can have complete coverage of a model. Okay, so you can have 100% coverage of a thing, but that thing is not what you're actually caring about. Okay, you can never have a complete model. Similarly, the more complete your model is, that is, the more accurate or the closer the model represents the thing that does actually matter, i.e., are people happy with our software and are willing to buy it, then the less we can economically cover. So the simple way to remember that is, the common measure of coverage, or the easiest measure of coverage, if you like, is generally statements of code. Okay, that's the thing that comes built into most tools these days, is that you can say, we ran your automated test suite and that struck 80% of the lines of code in our software. You might think, oh, excellent, good, high coverage. Well, I've got some bad news for you. Your customers don't buy your software by the line. They care about what your software does for them. So measuring your test coverage by lines of code is somewhat irrelevant to that ultimate aim. So just remember, it's the completeness of the model that matters more than how much of your model you've covered. Okay, pillar number 4 is about faster feedback. This is the one, I guess, that sits at the heart of Agile. Arguably, everything that we've talked about so far is applicable in a non-Agile testing context as well, but in Agile, this is the one that really is going to make or break your process. How quickly are you able to provide useful information about the issues you identified to the people that need that information? And another way of looking at it is how quickly are we able to know what is the action we need to take as a result of information we provide in testing? That, to me, is the important thing. In Agile, it's about using fast feedback in order to act upon it quickly. So a measure that I use is really how quickly are people responding and doing something about things that testers are finding and talking to people about. That's really the thing I look for in an organization, to see whether they've really grokked this idea of fast feedback from testing. There's also various layers. It's important to remember that there's, everything in Agile is really about a set of concentric cycles or interconnected gears, if you like. Starting at the very smallest level, it's the feedback cycle might be the time between having written a line of code and having a passing unit test for it. That's probably about the lowest level of this this chain. You can also talk about feedback at the feature level. How quickly can you put a new feature in and know that works? That's kind of the thing you might be doing several times a sprint. But then, how often are you showing this new working software to stakeholders, to the people that care and will have a valuable opinion about this? Because it's feedback from them that matters at this point. Are we in fact moving our product in the right direction according to what they want and expect? And indeed, how often are we getting this out in the real world? There's nothing quite like the feedback of the cold light of day and real customers. How often are we actually seeking that feedback? Too many organizations sort of back away from this and saying, oh, there's too much cost, too much risk. Well, that risk is really just the premium you pay for actually having valuable feedback from real customers. And indeed, if we think back to the top layer of our Maslows hierarchy of testing needs, well, how often are we checking that we are in fact getting some money back for the money we put into this whole process? That's our ultimate measure. And you could say, well, the problem is that's a slow cycle. I can't relate what I did today to the amount of money I made today, because the amount of money I made today was from actions I took months ago. Well, then look at those connections in your organization. Look at the cause and effect of your profit model. Try to understand whether you are the choices you're making are having the right financial impact. So, as I say, cycles within cycles in terms of feedback loops. Remember that you can shift from one to another. It's important that you remember that feedback applies at many levels. Okay, so don't just think of a single source of feedback like, you know, how fast my test suite is running or something like that. Okay, there's our 4 pillars. The final advice on those is, remember, you need to therefore understand, how can I improve each one, but also how do I make sure I'm extending or improving or raising each of those in balance with the others? Because what you don't want is an imbalance. You don't want to be focusing on one thing at the expense of others. Otherwise you're going to get this sort of lopsided pediment at the top. Now, that was all a little bit heavy, so I need to give you a little mental break here. So we're going to introduce genuine ancient Greek jokes here. There aren't many of them, okay? But I dug up, there's a little collection, Philogelos, I'm not sure if that's pronounced correctly, was this little collection of Greek jokes assembled around about 4th century AD. Now, as I say, Greek jokes, they're not quite, you know, for a modern audience. They're quite matched with modern sensibilities. But I'll give you one that was kind of okay. They like to make fun of academics, or they like to make fun of scholars. So there was a joke that says a scholar decided that he would go for a swim. He'd never swum before, and so he was going into the lake to swim. But because it was his first time, he nearly drowned in the process. And having just survived this, he said, he swore to himself, he's never going to go in the water again until he'd properly learned how to swim. Yeah. And that was the best of a bad bunch. So, unfortunately, you know, ancient Greek jokes haven't really survived the test of time. Okay, let's press on. So we've looked at pediment, entablature, and columns. This section at the bottom, which I originally called the foundations of my model, is correctly known as the crepidoma, but there's even more words to go with this. So specifically, the Greeks say the top step of that set of steps in the crepidoma is known as the Stylobate, and the remaining steps, there aren't always 2, but whatever the steps below the Stylobate, they are known collectively as the Stereobate. Okay, you're going to be a star in Scrabble with learning all these new words. Okay, so what's on our crepidoma, or what's in our Stylobate and Stereobate? Let's take a look. To the left side of the model are what I call collectively the team foundations. Okay, so these are the things that sit under providing stronger evidence and providing better design. And the upper stones of this section are about collaboration and communication. It seems a little bit obvious that, okay, that's what we need in an agile process. We need to collaborate. We need to be talking to each other. We need cross-role communications, inter-team communications, and so forth. But it's another one of those things that if you just stop there, it's easy to say, it's often hard to do. And usually that's because the things underneath, the things we depend upon in order to do that, aren't in place. And this is where you can start to, you know, hammer on the doors of management to start sort of fixing some of these underlying problems. So, do we have the right team structures? Many organizations are still clinging to this idea that, well, testing is owned by a test manager, and you know that person has their own sort of budget and control and so forth, and they're kind of in competition with the development manager, and it plays havoc in the idea of being able to have a mixed skill, multi-role, agile team of testers and developers doing whatever is necessary day by day to get working tested software out the door. So it's possible that the team structures in your organization are flawed in the first place. A second source of problems in communication is the idea of business engagement, where we can't, as technical teams, even get good access to the people that have the business knowledge that would inform the choices that we're trying to make day by day. Either because the business just aren't used to talking to IT, or that the organization doesn't let them, you know, that they're in different floors, different buildings even, You know, again, we have entire sort of management structures that are designed to separate business people and technical people. If those things are still part of your organization, that's a legacy that needs to be fixed. Okay, the crepidomal, or these stones, foundations, if you like, that are supporting better test design as well as greater coverage, as what I call the capability foundations. And this is all about what are the techniques we're applying and what are the skills and levels of experience of our people in applying those techniques. And test techniques, it's one of these things where I suppose Agile was seen as a little bit of a revolution, and the trouble with revolutions is you start by killing a lot of people, and then later on you realize maybe we shouldn't have killed everybody. Maybe there were some useful people in that crowd. And I think, you know, some of our traditional test techniques are kind of like the victims of the Agile revolution. We said, you know, old testing is bad, new testing is good. Kill everything associated with old testing. Go back to some of your textbooks. You know, look up some of these test techniques and realize, well, yeah, there's nothing specifically waterfall about these ideas. Maybe I could apply these. Maybe talk to some of the older people in your organization and say, well, yeah, we used to do that, but the Agile police would get me if I mention that. You know, don't mention that. Well, no, there are in fact. Am I on? Yep. Okay. There are in fact, you know, techniques that we've used a long time ago that are still valid. There's another little quick model that I want to share. I need to be conscious of time, but this one I can't take the credit for. Some colleagues of mine, along with Dan North, created this thing. I mean, I think Dan's calling it delivery mapping, but essentially it's about how do you understand the kind of skills in your organization and what do you do about them. I'm going to add these things fairly quickly because I need to recover some time. Essentially, there's things that people want to do, there's things people are currently able to do, and there's things that the organization needs. And it's what you do with the overlaps of those things. So you can either say, there's stuff that people can do and the organization needs, get those people to teach others. There's stuff that people want to do, and what they do, they already know how to do, they can practice those, but they practice them in their own time. Things that people want to do and the organization needs, stump up some training budget and get people trained in that, okay? And remember, perhaps the golden area at the intersection in the middle is some people want to learn this, some people can do this, and this is good for the organization, okay? That's what you want to maximize. Find every opportunity for people to pair together so that knowledge can be spread. You know, use brown bag sessions, any other sort of, formal or informal sharing mechanisms to be able to spread that knowledge throughout your organization. Yep, sorry, that was the last one. Okay, and our right-hand part of the model, the foundations that I would call the technical foundations, supporting faster feedback and also supporting greater coverage, well, most of this comes down to effective use of test automation. Now, again, everything that's pretty much on the top line is a little bit like, you know, Agile 101. It's, you've got to collaborate, you've got to work together, you've got to automate your tests. You know, as I say, that top line is kind of the easy stuff. It's the stuff underneath that makes those things hard in practice. So, or problems in the level underneath that makes the thing above hard. So, two things that I see as the main barriers to effective test automation is, have we even designed or architected our application for testability in the first place? Okay, that's kind of the number one issue. So we need to have architects, we need to have software developers and other decision makers affecting our software design and software architecture choices, realizing that a testable architecture is a good architecture. A testable architecture is loosely coupled. A testable architecture doesn't put business logic into UI. A testable architecture is neatly layered. It's easy to isolate and encapsulate. It's easy to mock. All those things support test automation, but those need to be built into our test architecture, our application architecture in the first place. The second thing that we need to have in place is strong configuration management. Okay, we need to have a handle on the basics of version control of our tests as well as our source code. We need to understand what's the state of our environments that we're working with. We need to have a good handle on test data. We need to be able to spin up test data sets quickly, tear them down easily. All those things are basic configuration management issues, and yet they often get overlooked in organizations. Okay, I'm going to reach the end here. The bottom layer, well, there's really not quite the bottom layer, but the things we've just looked at are also dependent on some fairly fundamental things. Okay, so having strong management, having strong leadership, having people who are prepared to make the tough decisions about these things that affect everything above, that's fundamental as well. Harder, arguably, for testers to change, but don't let that stop you from being a campaigner for that change. And similarly, engineering discipline. How much of that is really baked into your organization's culture? If you don't have it, it's going to be very hard to sort of champion things like good configuration management. So you need to see where can we restore that sense of importance in good engineering discipline and engineering practices. There's a final layer that sort of isn't really seen when you visit a temple, but it's there nonetheless. It's the foundations of the temple is known the Greeks call it the youth interior. And strictly that's the uppermost course, but I like to think of it as the foundations of the temple. Now, youth interior is an interesting word because if you've got teenage kids like I have, that's probably what comes to mind of a youth interior. But anyway, that's not what it means. So the youth interior is about where we've built our temple. What does it rest on? And for the purpose of our model, this is really your organizational culture, your organization's values. And so if we say, well, do you have strong leadership? Do you have the management will to change these sort of legacy structures that are impeding us? Well, that's going to be down to your culture. Is there a culture of, well, don't rock the boat, don't change things? Or is there a culture of, yep, if we're going to move forward, we need to move in the first place. We need change. We need to be able to bring in new ideas. If you have that kind of culture, then you've got a fighting chance. Now, some people would say, well, that's suggesting that everything else I wanted to improve is really doomed because the culture in my organization is one that's against change or it's anti-agile or something like that. Well, as they say, change your organization or change your organization. I would agree. These are, the further down you get in the model, the harder it is to change these things, but not everything is fixed, okay? Culture can change, and values can change. Okay, that was my model. What is it that you can do with this? If how might this be useful to you? Well, there's 3 ways that you can do this. Number one is you can use it as a way of discovering issues within your organization. At least use it to discuss with your team members, with your managers maybe. How is this relevant to our organization? It's a good thing to bring up in retrospectives. If people are looking for root causes of stuff, maybe you can sort of refer to things on this model. And similarly, it's useful for some kind of root cause analysis. If you're trying to do a 5 whys on some problem or issue that you've found recently, maybe see whether it chimes with anything that's on the model. Another way to use this is certainly the way I most commonly use it, is that you can use it to self-assess. See how do you think you would score on the basis of this model. You could provide a survey to people in your organization or maybe just in your team. And if you do that, what I recommend is you ask people to score 2 things. So for each of the elements, all you need to do is sort of pick out those elements on the model and you would say two things. How successful are we at this? And secondly, how important is this to our overall success? And by getting people to score those separately, you actually get some interesting data. Because some people will recognize that, okay, there's a particular thing, okay, test automation, yeah, all right, we don't do that, or we do very little of it, and it's not very, we don't do it very well. But some people will say, and that's critical to us going forward. Others will say, that's not important at all. So those differences are the interesting things to discuss. So finding out where people have different perceptions about what's important in reference to this model or anything else, that's a key data point, a key discussion point. So yes, you're looking for consensus hotspots, but you're also looking for variances. Where do people differ? And here's your third option, is you say, no, don't believe that. I think that's a load of rubbish. You can challenge this model, but challenge it constructively. Okay? If you think what I've said really doesn't apply to you, okay, think about why. What is it that, in your context, means that this model isn't appropriate? How would you adjust this model? How would you create your own model? Those are all perfectly valid and sensible things for you to do, and I invite you to do so. But I hope this model is, remember, it's wrong, but it might be useful. I hope it helps you to think about where might I see, where do I recognize elements of my own organization in this. Okay, that's me done. Thank you very much.